When I was 14 years old, my family and I went on a camping trip to a state park. My friend and I were excited to spend our days exploring the woods and our nights telling scary stories around the campfire. But little did we know, our adventure would take a dark and terrifying turn. As we set up our tents, my friend and I decided to take a walk through the woods, a ritual we called the walk. We loved navigating through the dense forest, using our flashlights to guide us through the darkness. But on this particular night, we decided to venture further into the woods than we ever had before. As we walked, the trees seemed to grow taller and the shadows deeper. We heard strange noises, like twigs snapping and leaves rustling, but we brushed it off as mere wildlife. But then, we heard the whispering, soft and low. It seemed to come from all around us. We spun around, shining our flashlights in every direction, but there was no one there. We tried to shake off the feeling of unease and continued our walk, but the whispering grew louder, more urgent. We stopped and listened, our hearts racing, and then we saw her, a woman crawling on the ground, her dark clothes blending into the shadows. She was whispering random words, her voice barely audible. We froze, our flashlights fixed on her. She looked up, her eyes locking onto ours, and stood up. "I'm looking for my campsite," she declared, her voice slurred. We exchanged a nervous glance and decided to help her. As we walked her back to the campground, she stumbled and staggered, her words slurring together. We finally found her campsite, but her friends were nowhere to be found. They had left her behind, unaware she was missing. We helped her into her tent, feeling relief and unease. As we walked back to our campsite, we couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. The next day we saw her again, sitting by the campfire, her eyes sunken and her skin pale. She barely acknowledged us, her gaze fixed on something in the distance. We tried to avoid her, but she kept appearing, always lurking in the shadows. One night, we decided to take the walk again, hoping to shake off the feeling of unease. But as we walked deeper into the woods, we heard the whispering again. This time it was louder, more urgent. We spun around, shining our flashlights in every direction, but there was no one there. And then we saw her, standing before us, her eyes black as coal, her skin gray as the trees. She was whispering, her voice growing louder, more menacing. We tried to run, but our feet felt heavy, as if rooted. She started to move towards us, her eyes fixed on ours, her whispering growing louder. We were paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was back at our campsite, my friend shaking me awake. "What happened?" I asked, my voice shaking. "You just collapsed," he replied, his eyes filled with concern. "We have to get out of here," I said, my voice firm. "We have to leave now." We packed our tents and left the campsite, never looking back. We never spoke of that night again, but the memory of the whispering woman stayed with me, haunting my dreams and making me wonder, what happened in those woods? When I first met Daniel, he seemed like a normal guy. We both needed a roommate to split the rent, and he was polite, clean, and easy to talk to. We moved into a small apartment together, and everything seemed fine. At first, living with Daniel was great. He cooked dinner sometimes, and was always ready to help with chores. We would watch movies together and talk about our days. He worked at a small bookstore downtown, and I had a job at a local coffee shop. Our lives were simple and calm. But then, things started to change. Daniel became more secretive. He would stay out late and sometimes come home with a strange look in his eyes. I would ask him where he had been, and he would shrug and say he had been out with friends. But something felt off. There were nights when I heard him talking on the phone in a calm voice, saying things that didn't make sense. Once, I heard him say they can't find out. It's too risky. One night I came home late from work. The apartment was dark except for a small light coming from Daniel's room. I heard a strange noise, like someone crying. I knocked on his door, but there was no answer. The crying stopped suddenly. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Daniel, are you okay?" I called out. There was a long silence before he replied, "Yeah, just tired. Going to bed now." The next morning, Daniel seemed like his usual self again, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. I started noticing other things. There were times when Daniel's clothes had small stains, and he quickly hid them. I found a small knife in the bathroom cabinet with dried blood on it. When I confronted him, he laughed it off, saying he cut himself while cooking. Days turned into weeks, and the feeling of dread grew stronger. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I started avoiding Daniel and spending more time at work or out with friends. But even then, I couldn't escape the fear that gripped me whenever I was home. One evening, I decided to do some investigating of my own. Daniel had gone out, and I knew he wouldn't be back for a few hours. I went into his room and started looking around. I felt guilty invading his privacy, but I needed to know what was going on. I opened his closet and found a box hidden under some clothes. My heart pounded as I opened it. Inside the box were newspaper clippings about several unsolved murders in our city. Each article was marked with notes in Daniel's handwriting. There were photos of the victims, details about the crime scenes, and even some small personal items that belonged to them. I felt sick to my stomach. My hands shook as I put everything back and closed the box. I had to get out of there. I grabbed my phone and left the apartment, not knowing where to go. I ended up at a nearby park, sitting on a bench trying to calm down. I called the police and told them everything I had found. When the police arrived, I showed them the box. They took it seriously and started asking me questions about Daniel. I told them about his strange behavior, the late nights, and the bloodstains. They assured me they would look into it. The next few days were a blur. I stayed with a friend, too scared to go back to the apartment. The police kept in touch, telling me they were watching Daniel. They needed more evidence before they could make an arrest. Finally, one night, I got a call from the police. They had arrested Daniel. He had been caught trying to dispose of another victim's belongings. The police had linked him to several murders through the evidence they found in our apartment. I felt a mix of relief and horror. The person I had been living with, the person I had shared my life with, was a murderer. I went back to the apartment to pack my things. It felt different, darker. Every corner seemed to hold a secret, every shadow a hidden danger. I couldn't believe I had lived with a killer and hadn't known. As I packed, I found a note in my room. It was from Daniel. "I'm sorry you found out this way. I never wanted to hurt you. You were the only real friend I had. Goodbye." I left the apartment that night, never to return. I moved to a different city, trying to start fresh, but the memories haunted me. Every night, I wondered how I had missed the signs. I wondered how many lives could have been saved if I had noticed sooner. Living with Daniel changed me forever. I became more cautious and more aware of the people around me. I never let anyone get too close. The fear and mistrust stayed with me, a reminder of the dark secret I had lived with, the secret of my roommate, the murderer. I was driving down an empty highway one night, the road stretching out in front of me like a dark ribbon. The only light came from my car's headlights and the pale sliver of the moon hanging in the sky. It was late and I was tired. The radio had lost its signal miles back, leaving me alone with the hum of the engine and my thoughts. As I drove, I noticed the gas gauge was dangerously low. I should have filled up at the last town, but I thought I could make it to the next one. Now I wasn't so sure. The needle was hovering just above empty, and there wasn't a gas station in sight. Suddenly, the car started to sputter. I pressed down on the gas pedal, but it didn't help. The engine made a choking noise, and then, with a final cough, it died. I coasted to a stop on the side of the road, my heart sinking. No, I muttered, turning the key in the ignition. The engine cranked, but refused to start. I tried again, but it was no use. I was out of gas in the middle of nowhere. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. I was completely cut off. The road was empty, and there were no houses or businesses around. Just trees and darkness. I decided to lock the car and wait inside. Maybe someone would come by, or maybe the signal would return if I waited long enough. I didn't want to leave the car and wander around in the dark. It felt safer inside, with the doors locked. Time passed slowly. I checked my phone every few minutes, but there was still no signal. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I tried to stay calm, but my nerves were starting to fray. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I turned my head and saw a figure emerging from the woods. My heart pounded in my chest as the figure came closer. It was a man, tall and thin, with wild hair and a scruffy beard. He looked like he'd been living in the woods for a while. He walked up to my car and stopped by the driver's side window. He peered in at me, his eyes wide and wild. Then he started knocking on the window, slowly at first, then harder. The sound echoed in the still night air.
"Hey, let me in,"
he said, his voice muffled through the glass. "I need help." I shook my head, my hands gripping the steering wheel. There was no way I was letting this stranger into my car. "Please," he said, knocking harder. "Let me in." I didn't know what to do. My mind raced with possibilities. What did he want? Why was he out here in the middle of the night? I felt a chill run down my spine. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I saw headlights approaching from behind. A car was coming. Relief washed over me. I honked the horn, hoping to get the driver's attention. The approaching car slowed down and came to a stop behind me. It was a police car. 2 officers got out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They walked up to my car, and the man from the woods stepped back, his eyes darting nervously. "Is everything all right here?" one of the officers asked, shining his flashlight into my car. I quickly unlocked the door and got out. "My car ran out of gas," I said, my voice shaky. This man came out of the woods and started knocking on my window. "I don't know what he wants." The officers turned to the man, who was standing a few feet away, looking anxious. "Sir, what are you doing out here?" one of the officers asked. The man didn't answer. He just turned and started walking back into the woods. The officers watched him go, then turned back to me. "You're lucky we came by," the second officer said. "It's not safe to be out here alone at night. We'll call a tow truck for you and give you a ride to the nearest town." I nodded, grateful and relieved. As I got into the back of the police car, I glanced back at the woods. The man had disappeared into the darkness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. That night on the dark highway was something I would never forget. It reminded me how quickly things can go wrong and how important it is to be prepared. And it left me with a lingering sense of unease, wondering what might have happened if the police hadn't shown up when they did. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. I had just turned 30 when I decided to rent a room in a 3-bedroom house. The landlord, Mr. Thompson, seemed eager to lease the space without any background checks. I found that odd, but I needed a place quickly and his rent was cheap. So I moved in without asking too many questions. The house was old, but comfortable. There were 3 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a cozy living room, and a bathroom that I had to share with my only roommate, Elizabeth. She worked nights, slept during the day, and kept to herself. Although I had lived there for over a month, I had never actually seen her. Our schedules didn't overlap, and she seemed to be very private. From the beginning, strange things started happening. My belongings would be moved. I'd leave my keys on the kitchen counter and find them on the dining table. My toothbrush would be wet when I hadn't used it. At first, I thought I was just being forgetful, but the unease grew. One day, I came home from work to find the front door slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it that morning. I walked in cautiously, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" There was no answer. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. I double-checked all the windows and doors that night, making sure they were securely locked. Then there were the sounds. Late at night, I would hear footsteps above me, even though Elizabeth was supposed to be at work. Once, I heard a faint humming, like someone singing a lullaby. It was eerie and made my skin crawl. I convinced myself it was just the house settling or my imagination. The turning point came one Friday night. I decided to relax and watch some TV in the living room. I was watching a late-night show, trying to unwind when I felt it, the sensation of being watched. I turned around, but saw nothing. I shook it off and continued watching. Suddenly, the living room light flicked off. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The TV was still on, casting a dim glow across the room. I turned around slowly and saw a shadow in the hallway. It was Elizabeth. She stood there for a moment, then turned and walked away without a word. "Elizabeth?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response. I got up, switched the light back on, and hurried to my room, locking the door behind me. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about her standing there in the dark, watching me. The next morning, I decided I had had enough. I packed a small bag and went to a nearby motel. I needed some time away to clear my head. I called Mr. Thompson and told him about the strange occurrences. He seemed concerned, but didn't offer much help. At the motel, I finally got a decent night's sleep. The next day, I returned to the house to gather more of my things. When I walked in, the house felt different, quieter. I quickly went to my room and started packing. As I was leaving, I passed Elizabeth's door. It was slightly open. Curiosity got the better of me. I gently pushed the door open and peered inside. The room was dark, but I could make out a small bed, a dresser, and some old photographs on the wall. It looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. Confused, I stepped inside and took a closer look at the photos. They were of a young woman who looked a lot like Elizabeth. One picture caught my eye. It was of Mr. Thompson, much younger, standing next to the woman. On the back, it was dated 20 years ago. A chill ran down my spine. I realized that the woman in the photo was Elizabeth, but how could that be? She looked the same now as she did back then. I heard a creak behind me and turned around quickly, but no one was there. I grabbed the photo and ran out of the house, my mind racing. I went straight to Mr. Thompson's office. When I showed him the photo, he turned pale. He confessed that Elizabeth was his sister. She had disappeared 20 years ago under mysterious circumstances. He had kept her room exactly as it was, hoping she would return someday. I felt a mix of fear and sadness. The Elizabeth First had been living with was not his sister, but something else. I didn't know what to believe anymore. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I moved out that same day and found a new place to live. I never went back to the old house. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about Elizabeth. Who or what was she? I may never know, but one thing is certain, some mysteries are better left unsolved. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. My girlfriend at the time and I went camping 5 hours away from home for our anniversary. We made the trip the day after a big storm passed through. We left town early and got there in the early afternoon. The guy at the entrance to the campgrounds mentioned there was no one else staying there that weekend. We were like, oh, this is gonna be sick. First, we drove down these long pathways to our designated area. As you got closer to it, the road narrowed. So basically, you had to back out to get out. We unloaded the car, got the tent set up, and decided to go walk around the woods. It was dead silent, but it was still bright out, so we just took in all the nature we could and walked a few miles away. We reached this point in the woods where there were some weird-looking white cabins. They were very uniform, all built the same way, like, I guess they were a part of the camping grounds, but they seemed way out of the way, and there was no sign of life. It felt eerie to be at like we shouldn't be there. So we turned around and walked back. We took a breather in the tent, then tried to start a fire in the fire pit. Unfortunately, neither of us had ever been camping before and had no idea how to start a fire. We had bought some of those self-lighting logs from Walmart and some lighter fluid, but everything else around us was soaked to the bone from the rain that had passed through the day before. We knew we needed kindling of some sort, but any dry sticks or leaves were far and few between. Eventually, we got a small fire going, ate hot dogs and marshmallows, and spent some time looking at the stars. Then we noticed just how dark it was out there. My girlfriend was easily spooked and was like, "Can we get into the tent now?" So we put the fire out and crawled into the tent. We were talking to each other, but I could tell she was tense. Suddenly, she put her hand over my mouth and was like, "Shh! Do you hear that?" Before I could respond, we heard heavy footsteps. It sounded like a group of people walking. I whispered to her, "It's probably just animals or something." Then we heard mumbling, like low mumbling. We couldn't make out words, but it didn't sound like a sound an animal could make. It sounded like words, but hushed and non-elaborated. We sat in silence, staring at each other in the dark for what felt like forever. The mumbling got louder, as did the footsteps, until it sounded like it was right outside of our tent. We both froze. I don't think either of us were breathing. And then silence. We waited and waited and waited. I'm still not sure how much time passed. Eventually, my girlfriend said, "We have to get to your car." The adrenaline was pumping, so I peeked out of the tent into the darkness and told her to stay behind me, and then we ran to the car. I locked the doors. I kept looking around for any signs of life, but we were seemingly alone. I looked at her and was like, "Okay, I'm gonna grab our stuff. You stay in the car." We only had our ice chest and our tent out. I hopped out and ran, grabbed our ice chest, and tossed it into the back seat. As I turned around to go get the tent, I started hearing footsteps closing in again. In a moment of pure terror, I yanked the tent out of the ground, wrapped the tarp around it, slung it over my shoulder like some panicked Santa Claus, and shoved it into the trunk. I didn't say anything when I got in the car except, "Do we have everything in here?" My girlfriend said yes, and I floored it in reverse out of our camping area. Then we came to a fork in the road that went in like 6 different directions. I asked my girlfriend if she remembered which path we came down to get in here, and she told me she didn't know. We chose a random one and ended up in a different camping spot. I cursed under my breath and slammed it into reverse again. Then I noticed from the angle we had exited from, I could see the main path back to the gate, thanks to a small sign behind an overgrown bush. As we hightailed it out of there, I noticed there was a single small green light out in the woods to our right, near where our designated spot was. We drove the entire 5 hours back to our hometown and fell asleep on my girlfriend's parents' couch at around 4 a.m. We never talked about the trip ever again, and I haven't had any desire to camp since. I live in a small town in South Texas. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone and not much happens. When I was 19, my boyfriend Jack, 2 friends, Amy and Mike, and I decided to go for a late-night drive. We were bored and looking for something exciting to do. It was a warm summer night, and we drove around aimlessly for a while, talking and laughing. At some point, Jack suggested we go to an old cemetery on the outskirts of town. It hadn't been used since the 1800s and was known for being creepy. We all thought it was a great idea at the time. Little did we know what we were getting ourselves into. We drove down an old back road that was barely wide enough for Jack's car. The trees on either side were thick and tall, making it even darker. The only light came from the headlights of the car. The further we went, the quieter it got. No more crickets, no more rustling leaves, just the sound of our car tires on the gravel road. It was about 3 a.m. when we finally pulled up to the cemetery. The gate was old and rusty, barely hanging on to its hinges. Jack stopped the car, and we all got out. The air was cool, and a light fog had started to roll in, adding to the eerie atmosphere. As we stood there, I felt a chill run down my spine. The cemetery was silent, except for the occasional hoot of an owl. We walked a few steps in when Amy noticed something in the distance. "What's that?" she whispered, pointing towards the far end of the cemetery. We all squinted, trying to see what she was talking about. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then I saw them too. 4 white hooded figures were circling a grave. They moved slowly and deliberately, almost like they were performing some kind of ritual. My heart started to race. "We should go," I said, my voice trembling, but no one moved. We were all frozen, staring at the strange figures. Jack, who usually acted brave, looked just as scared as the rest of us. "Yeah, let's get out of here," he finally said. We turned around and hurried back to the car. Jack fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. As soon as the engine roared to life, he sped off, leaving the cemetery and the hooded figures behind us. The drive back was silent. No one spoke a word. We were all too shaken up by what we had seen. When we finally reached the town, Jack parked the car, and we all just sat there for a moment, trying to process what had happened. "What do you think they were doing?" Amy asked, breaking the silence. "I don't know, and I don't want to know," Mike replied, his voice still shaky. We all agreed that whatever it wasn't something we wanted to stick around to find out. We promised each other that we would never go back to that cemetery and never speak of it again. But the memory stayed with me. Every time I drove past that old back road, I felt a shiver run down my spine. I couldn't help but wonder who those hooded figures were and what they were doing in that old cemetery at 3 a.m. I never thought I'd end up with such a peculiar roommate. It all began innocently enough when I moved into a small apartment in the heart of the city. The rent was cheap and the location was perfect for my job. Little did I know that my new roommate would turn out to be a source of endless unease and terror. His name was Alex, a tall, thin man with deep-set eyes that always seemed to be staring into some unseen void. At first, I brushed off his odd behavior as mere eccentricity. He kept to himself mostly, spending hours locked away in his room. But as the days passed, I started noticing strange things. It started with the whispers. Late at night, when the rest of the world was asleep, I could hear Alex muttering to himself behind closed doors. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe he was just talking on the phone or watching a strange movie. But the whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if he was engaged in some sinister conversation with an invisible entity. Then came the smells. Foul odors seemed to emanate from Alex's room, like something rotten and decayed. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the old building showing its age. But the stench grew stronger with each passing day until it was impossible to ignore. I confronted Alex about it, but he just laughed it off, claiming he had spilled something and hadn't gotten around to cleaning it up. But it wasn't just the whispers and the smells that unnerved me. It was the way Alex moved like a shadow drifting through the night. He never seemed to sleep, always awake when I stumbled out of bed in the middle of the night for a glass of water. His eyes would follow me, dark and unreadable, sending shivers down my spine. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to investigate. I crept down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest until I reached Alex's door. It was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of light spilling out into the darkness. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open. What I saw inside will haunt me for the rest of my days. Alex was standing in the center of the room, surrounded by candles that cast flickering shadows across the walls. In his hand, he held a book, its pages yellowed with age. But it wasn't the sight of him that froze me in place. It was what he was doing. He was chanting, his voice low and guttural, as if speaking in tongues. I couldn't understand the words, but the air seemed to thrum with dark energy. And then, in the corner of the room, I saw it. A figure, hunched and twisted, its eyes glowing with malevolence. I stumbled backward, my heart racing as I fled from the room. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of my bed, where I huddled beneath the covers, praying for the morning to come. But morning brought no relief. If anything, things only got worse. Alex's behavior grew more erratic, his whispers more frenzied. And then, one night, he disappeared altogether. I searched the apartment from top to bottom, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, lurking in the shadows, watching and waiting. Weeks passed, and still there was no sign of Alex. I tried to go about my life as usual, but the fear gnawed at me, a constant presence in the back of my mind. And then one night I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from somewhere within the walls. At first, I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just a rat or a mouse. But the scratching grew louder, more insistent, until it was all I could hear. And then, one by one, they started to appear. Dark, twisted figures crawled out of the shadows like something out of a nightmare. I watched in horror as they skittered across the floor, their eyes fixed on me with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. I knew then that I had to leave, to get as far away from that place as possible. But as I turned to go, I saw him, Alex, standing in the doorway, his eyes cold and empty. "You can't leave," he said, his voice like ice. "You belong to us now." I fled then, running as fast as my legs would carry me, never looking back. And though I've tried to forget, to put that night behind me, I know that I will never truly escape. The memory of Alex and his strange behavior will haunt me until the end of my days, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurks just beneath the surface of our world. It was a night, and the sky was getting darker by the minute. I was driving home with my 2 young children in the back seat. They had been arguing and fussing, and I was at wit's end. I decided to pull over to the side of the road to calm them down and talk to them. I turned on the car's hazard lights and stepped out, opening the back door to look at my kids. Listen, you two, I said firmly. You need to stop fighting and be quiet. It's late, and we need to get home safely. I noticed a car pulling up beside us as I was talking to them. The driver rolled down the window, and a middle-aged couple smiled at me. The man leaned out and said, "Hey there, are you okay?" "Yes, we're fine," I replied. Just had to calm the kids down. The woman in the passenger seat nodded and said, "We wanted to let you know there's been a wreck over the next hill. Traffic is completely stopped. It would help if you took the side road a little way back. It will detour you around the wreck and get you home faster." I thanked them for the advice, and they waved as they drove off. I got back into my car and buckled up, still thinking about what they had said. I didn't know the area too well, and taking a side road in the dark didn't seem like a good idea. I decided to stick to the main road, even if it meant being stuck in traffic for a while. As I drove past the road they mentioned, I glanced over and saw something that made my heart skip a beat. The couple's car was parked on the side of the detour road, and they were both standing outside. They weren't moving, they were just standing there, staring into the woods. There was nothing but dense trees all around them. The sight was eerie, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I shook off the feeling and kept driving. I figured they might have stopped for a moment, or maybe they had car trouble. As I crested the hill, I was surprised to see that there was no wreck, no traffic jam, just an empty road ahead. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as I drove on. The rest of the drive was uneventful. My kids had finally settled down, and I was grateful to get home and put them to bed. But I couldn't stop thinking about that couple and the strange detour they suggested. Something about it just didn't sit right with me. The next morning, I had to take the same road for some errands. As I approached the detour road, I felt my heartbeat quicken. I slowed down as I got closer, and that's when I saw it. Just past where the couple had parked their car, there was a large sign that read, "Dead End." My mind raced, thinking about how they had stood there, in the dark, with nowhere to go. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Why would they send me down a dead-end road? What were they doing there? And why did they disappear so quickly after talking to me? Years have passed since that night, but I still think about it often. Every time I drive past that detour road, I feel a shiver down my spine. I wonder what would have happened if I had taken their advice and turned down that road. Would I have been stuck in the middle of nowhere? Or worse? One thing is for sure, I'll never forget the chilling sight of that couple standing by their car, surrounded by nothing but dark woods. It still gives me chills to this day, even 15 years later. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving alone, I think I see their car out of the corner of my eye. It's always in the same spot, just past the hill before the dead-end sign. But when I look directly, there's nothing there. It's as if they're still out there waiting. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I'm glad I didn't follow their detour. It's a mystery that haunts me, a reminder that not everything is as it seems. I trust my instincts more now, especially when I'm out on those lonely country roads. So if you ever find yourself driving through the countryside and a friendly couple offers you a shortcut, think twice. Sometimes the long way around is the safest home. It was a late Friday night when I finally left the office. The clock on my dashboard showed it was almost midnight. I had been working late all week, and I was exhausted. The regular route home through the city was always busy, even at this hour, so I decided to take a more rural route. It was longer, but much quieter. I thought the peaceful drive might help me unwind after a long day. I turned onto the narrow country road. The moon was full, and the stars were bright. The road was empty, and all I could hear was the hum of my car engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It was kind of nice, just me and the open road, but soon I started to feel a little uneasy. The night seemed darker, the air colder. After a few miles, I saw the old bridge up ahead. I had crossed it a few times before, but only during the day. At night, it looked different, more eerie. The bridge was made of wood and iron, and it creaked even when no cars were on it. It had been there for many years, long before I was born. As I got closer to the bridge, I noticed a strange red fog rolling in. It was thick and seemed to glow faintly. I had never seen anything like it before. The red fog made the bridge look even scarier. I felt a chill run down my spine, and my heart started to race. Something about the fog didn't feel right, but I told myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. I drove onto the bridge, and the wooden planks creaked under the weight of my car. The fog grew thicker, and I could barely see a few feet in front of me. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and I pressed my foot on the gas pedal, wanting to get across the bridge as quickly as possible. The air felt heavy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Finally, I reached the other side of the bridge. I let out a sigh of relief and glanced in my rearview mirror. My heart nearly stopped. There, standing in the middle of the bridge, was a figure. It looked like a woman in a white dress, her long hair hanging down. She was just standing there staring at my car. I blinked and looked again, but the figure was still there. My mind raced. Who could be out there at this hour, in the middle of nowhere? I felt a surge of fear. I didn't dare stop or turn back. I just kept driving, my eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror. The figure didn't move, just kept standing there in the red fog, watching me drive away. When I got home, I locked all the doors and windows, my heart still pounding. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, a shadow in the fog. But deep down, I knew it was something more. The next morning, I couldn't shake the memory of that figure on the bridge. Over breakfast, I mentioned it to my parents. They exchanged a look, and my dad's face grew serious. "You saw her, didn't you?" he asked quietly. "Who?" I replied, my voice shaking a little. "The girl on the bridge," he said. "There's an old story about that bridge. Many years ago, a young lady hung herself from it. They say her spirit still haunts the place." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "What happened to her?" "No one knows for sure," Dad said. "Some say she was waiting for her lover, who never showed up. Others say she was running from something or someone. But everyone agrees on one thing: she died on that bridge, and her spirit never left." I sat there, my breakfast forgotten. The figure in the red fog made sense now, but it also made everything worse. I had seen a ghost, the ghost of a young lady who had taken her own life. The rest of the weekend passed in a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about the bridge and the figure in the fog. Sunday night, I barely slept, dreading the drive to work the next morning. When Monday came, I took the city route, even though it was busy and took longer. For weeks, I avoided the rural route and the bridge, but the memory of that night stayed with me. I would dream of the bridge, the red fog, and the figure standing there watching me. Each time, I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. One evening, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to look up the story of the bridge. I found old newspaper articles and local legends. The young lady's name was Emily. She was supposed to meet her lover on the bridge one night, but he never came. Heartbroken, she hung herself from the iron railings. People in the area had reported seeing her ghost for years. They described the red fog and the figure in the white dress, just like I had seen. Some said she was looking for her lover, others that she was trying to find peace. Knowing the story didn't make it easier. If anything, it made it harder. I felt sorry for Emily, trapped in her sorrow for eternity. I wondered if there was a way to help her, to let her find peace. One Friday night, a month after I had seen her, I found myself driving the rural route again. I had to know if she was still there. As I approached the bridge, my heart raced, and I felt that familiar chill. The red fog was there, thick and glowing. I drove onto the bridge, and there she was, standing in the middle, just as before. I stopped the car and rolled down the window. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though I wasn't sure she could hear me. "I hope you find peace." For a moment, the figure stood still. Then slowly she started to fade, the red fog lifting. I watched until she disappeared completely, leaving only the quiet night behind. I drove home with a strange sense of calm. I hoped that somehow Emily had found some peace. I never saw her again after that night, but I always remembered her and the old bridge. If you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks.